Welcome back to Firewatch Live. I'm Tom DeSorcy alongside Scott Metzler. And in our last session, we talked about how leadership can happen at any level, whether you're in charge or not. Well, today we are shifting gears to focus on the relationship side or the relational side of leadership, if you will. Strong leadership is built on strong relationships. Scott will guide us through how connections with the people around us help to shape the quality of leadership in an organization, whether it's through personal interactions, shared downtime, or authentic conversations. Relationships are the foundation of good leadership. Scott, a pleasure to have you with us once again.
Good to be here, Tom. Thank you.
I got to just right out of the gate when I thought of this conversation today, and the idea that, well, tongue in cheek, I've heard it before, where you say you can't be their friend or you can't be their boss if you're their friend. Is that an old mantra that you remember?
It is. And I think there's probably a lot of truth there. And so, I don't know that the leader follower dichotomy necessarily needs to be a friendship, but it certainly helps if we can figure out how to be friendly about it.
You say that you can measure the quality of leadership in an organization by the strength of relationships. And this goes back to something we talked about at another session and about the measurement. I want to talk about the gauge that you might use to measure your leadership, but explain that further about measuring the quality through the strength of your relationships.
Right. So, through my work as a leadership coach and my work in organizational development, I get to be around lots of groups and teams and organizations. And, this idea of relationality as a measure of leadership, when you walk into a room full of people you've never met before, you can almost just sort of intuitively feel, in reading the room, the strengths of the relationships. And as conversations unfold and human interactions take place, you can really see these places where people have put in the work to build strong relationships and the places that people have not. My experience has been when I find places who have done the hard work of relationship building, they have strong leadership cultures.
When you present in these groups and you meet these groups, how do you change the presentation? I wonder. I've always thought about that. When you say you read the room, how does that change the way you deliver to a group like this?
Right. One of the things I love to do is to lead with curiosity and to present and sort of navigate these spaces from a sense of not being the person in the room who knows the most. And so, wherever I go and whatever I do, my first order of business is to ask really good questions. And once I start to gain some understanding through those answers, I can figure out how we might navigate the space together for the mutual benefit of everyone.
It's sort of shifting gears and sort of, I guess you're almost customizing a presentation on the fly, and it may give you, it might take you in the wrong direction, I would think.
Right, right. Yeah. So, one of the things, one of the early questions that I ask before I set foot in the room is, what folks want to get from this interaction? What would you like to be different when we walk out? And that, that first question is the first intervention. And so, from there, I love this idea of co-creation. And so, wherever I go, I've got a list of things that are important to me that we cover and navigate. But I also know that everyone else in the room has that same list, and they have different things on it. And so we get those things out into the open and we start that relationship building, right up front.
When I read or listen or hear the term measure the quality of your leadership, and I think that's the leader looking back to see, I guess, gauge how they're doing. And we talked about how you rate your success or of your leading, if you will. Is this how you would rate your success?
I think this is one measure, and it's definitely a qualitative measure. And so I don't know that in the context of this conversation that we're necessarily looking to, for a letter grade or to put a number to it. But a lot of this measurement is how the people feel, both, the formal leaders, the informal leaders, and, all the other members of the group, how they feel about the place in which they, share their talents and their gifts and their abilities.
I want to know more about interpersonal relationships in terms of being a leader and how that actually
Sure.
takes shape, and maybe give us some examples.
You bet. So, the interesting thing to me is that, this idea that leadership is relational is very intuitive. And, on the surface, importantly, we're talking about interpersonal relationship, one on one conversations. So, we're going past, hey, how's the wife and kids? How is the hockey game? That sort of thing. You've heard me say before that leadership is about deeply knowing people. And it's hard to deeply know people without being in authentic conversation with them. So I feel like that's the first level of this idea of relationality. As you dig a little bit deeper, and what the academic literature tells us is that relationality has a lot to do with the environments that we create together. And so I think a deeper understanding and sort of, one step bolder on the relationality scale is this idea of a leader's job. And so by leader, of course, I'm talking about the big L leaders with authority, and the rest of us small L leaders who maybe don't have titles in corner offices, to get the environment right, where leadership can bubble up from all quarters, and where people feel welcome to show up with their whole selves.
Is that what you mean when you say authentic sharing?
Absolutely. You bet. You bet. So, it's important, especially the higher up we go in the hierarchy of formal authority, for us to spend time with the people who look to us for leadership. And so in the fire service, certainly, that might look like chief officers rounding to the stations and making sure that they have FaceTime or a cup of coffee with the troops. That looks different in different organizations. So certainly that's a part of it. A bigger part might be this idea of, normalizing conflict and normalizing conversations about how we behave with one another, especially when we disagree.
Do you see that going both ways, from the big L leader and the person they're leading, that relationship helps?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, there are about as many leadership theories and frameworks and approaches as there are people on the planet. And one of the direct outcomes from having these authentic interactions and having conversations about conversations about conflict, conversations about how we lead and how we behave with one another, is the ability for us to all be on the same page. And so, when we talk about cultural development and cultural change, often the first step of those initiatives is to build a shared framework of language. And so, making those things that often don't get talked about explicit in an organization really, helps people surface their authentic selves and get clear about the game they're playing. Because, it occurs to me that if I think I'm operating in a system where dissenting views and oppositional voices are valued, but I'm actually not in that kind of system, that's a recipe for disaster. So just making sure that everybody is up to speed on mutual expectations.
Let's drop into the fire world, which you and I are
Sure.
both familiar with, in terms of the volunteer side of the fire scene, which is like 80% of Canada, for example, are volunteer firefighters. It's easy or unavoidable, I would think, to have those relationships because we know each other in the community. Is that How does that change how you are a leader? And again, you used the word appropriate at one point. I remember you reading that, where that's important as well.
You bet. You bet. So this idea of deep knowing of people, I think has to have some boundaries, and it's hard to, It's hard to articulate those boundaries sometimes when these are the people that you went to school with and that, you go to church with and cook out on the weekends with. And so, navigating this road from buddy to boss oftentimes is fraught with challenges. And so again, I feel like I'm kind of a one trick pony, going back to this idea of clear, transparent, authentic communication. But in my view, that is the best way to make sure we know where those guardrails are. We know where the bounds of friendship are versus the bounds of, perhaps my authority role or your authority role. And so, talking about those things in advance before there's conflict, that's so important. And I'm speaking from experience here. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, right? So when things are going well, I don't want to upset the apple cart and, bring in this idea of conflict, but that's when we should be talking about those things.
Again, in the volunteer fire world, and I've seen this numerous times, and it works, in my opinion, in most cases where you will have quite often a spousal connection in the
Right.
fire department, you know. And
Right.
I mean, how do you, when you think about that and think about that dynamic where your partner could be the fire chief and you're a firefighter, it works, or are you warning people about this?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm warning people about this, but I think, obviously this deserves a little bit of attention. And I feel like this kind of goes back to this idea that if we've got the interpersonal relationships right, if we've got a strong foundation, whether that's, high school friends, whether that's a, romantic interest or a spouse, um, we have to have those strong relationships before we can have this, strong leadership connection.
You wonder, I wonder if perhaps in that dynamic that that the relationship that you have at home translates better to the leadership relation, if you will, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably situational, and so I've certainly seen that kind of relationship go both ways. Sure.
What's the warning, if any, for people that, again, you're saying be relational with, the buddy buddy or, being their friend? What's the caveat?
Yeah, I think the caveat is, too much of a good thing isn't necessarily a good thing. And so, identifying those boundaries, building those guardrails between personal relationship, professional relationship, whether we're talking about a career fire department, a volunteer fire department, or some other kind of organization, I think that's really important.
We've spoke of and you've written about getting the environment right and ensuring that the culture supports people exercising leadership. Can you explain that?
You bet. You bet. So, as you know, I am a really big proponent of shared leadership. So, this idea that often the strongest organizations, the strongest groups, the strongest teams are those that embrace the idea that leadership can be done at any time, from any place, from any position. And so, getting that environment right is kind of a tricky proposition. And so, again, everybody needs to know the rules of the game they're playing. And so, I've done, some work with organizations that have invited me in to help sort of develop this idea of distributed leadership where everybody has a voice, helping people understand how they might contribute to making the environment, the work group better. And when that work starts to sort of grow legs and become strong and stand on its own, sometimes that's unwelcome behavior from bosses who don't necessarily want that to happen. And so, in one sense, they kind of they know the right words to say, but when they see the behavior, it's kind of an affront and it's kind of a challenge to their authority. And so, getting that environment right where everybody understands what leadership is, what leadership looks like, finding those healthy boundaries and guardrails. That's really important in getting the environment right for leadership to bubble up.
Speak more of the boundaries and how to watch for those.
You bet. So, one of the interesting concepts that I find that people have, some difficulty with, but that is so important, is this idea of unity of leadership. And so, in an organization, in a healthy organization where leadership is shared, it's not uncommon for people to sort of check their titles at the door. And so, we might assemble a leadership team or some other kind of work group to speak frankly and honestly about the challenges that we see, the opportunities that are before us, and how we might make things better for the people who not only work here, but who look to us for leadership and for service. And so, oftentimes when the boss or the bosses, those people, with positional authority are in the room, sometimes people are less willing to speak openly about the things that are important to the organization. And so, when we get the environment right, we have the ability to speak freely only when the boundaries exist and we're clear about who the decision maker is. And so if it's a group decision, that's great. That just needs to be explicit up front so that everybody knows at the end of this, maybe we're going to take a vote and the majority rules. On the other side of the coin, though, is this idea of inviting people into conversation to share their unvarnished opinions, whether I like them or not as the authority figure, but also to say, this is a time bound decision at 3 o'clock. I'm going to make the decision. I'm going to weigh all of the input on the table. But at the end of the day, the decision belongs to me. So that to me is a pretty clear example of setting up those boundaries, setting up the rules of engagement so that no one is surprised at the end of the day when the decision is made one way or another.
When we talk about bringing people, or I guess working with people that we know or grew up with, or again, know on a off work basis, if you will. What about the other side of that coin, where that leader comes from the outside, so to speak? Where
Right.
that leader comes in, and it's not necessarily someone that you brought up through the ranks. Again, sort of a fire theme there, but it's someone that's brought in from the outside. Are you saying then that it's a lot more difficult to try and work at the relationships?
I don't know that it's more difficult to work at the relationships, but it certainly is going to take some intentional behaviors toward that. And so again, that in my mind, that would be a really great opportunity for an authority figure to lead with curiosity, to sort of get the feel of the culture before making a lot of decisions, before trying to change things. Even if things desperately need to be changed, there's probably a reason or two that things are the way they are. And understanding those reasons, I think, is the first step towards building and maintaining those important relationships.
We talk to people, the listener, the viewer that is the leader or the potential leader. And for those that are potential leaders that are being led currently, they have a role to play, I would think, in developing that relationship as well. Would you agree?
Absolutely. You bet. You bet. And so, the willingness to express your voice, the willingness to, uh, you know, identify those areas within an organization or a group or a team in which, one might step into that scary space of leadership without authority and make things better. Those are leadership behaviors that can be learned, that can be developed, and that should be recognized and rewarded.
We it's a question that I've often thought about, and looking at the way, we're training leaders. We're doing this right now. We're telling people and explaining how you can be better or be a good leader. Um, are we as leaders now, in turn, are we training people to be led? You know what I mean by that? Like when
Mm,
you're doing a recruit class, and this is the fire service. Here's how you be a firefighter. Here's the personal protective equipment. Here's all that going through the fire motion. Is there enough being taught? Culture's culture, but how do we and when do we say this is who you are in the fire service? This is the boss. This is how you treat them.
right.
Or is it just sort of led by example? Are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. And so, if we're going to talk about leadership, if we're going to develop leadership behaviors, it only seems right that we also talk about followership and developing followership behaviors. And so, rather than seeing those things as opposite ends of a continuum, I tend to think that they're sort of, the same face of one coin. And so, certainly those are behaviors and not necessarily positions. And so, depending on the context, depending on the situation, depending on the type of leadership that's called for. So certainly, at the scene of an emergency incident may not be the best place for democratized leadership. We might be looking for those crisis leaders to stand tall, to make decisive interventions, and to be very directive, right? So we need people to understand the time and place for shared leadership versus saluting smartly and carrying out the orders, so to speak.
It's it's all part of that know your role, I would think.
You bet. You bet. Which I think is another really important reason to have these conversations, and not just once, not just twice, but for these conversations about how we behave with one another, especially when we don't agree with one another. Uh, those conversations need to sort of be the fabric of our organization, because that's how we develop strong cultures.
Back to the discussion on boundaries, and I think we've kind of alluded or got a little bit into the side where, as a leader, when you know you've gone too far, and how do you stop and how do you repair that?
Oh, right. So one of the things that I learned, actually from a group I was hired to do some work with. So every time I go into an organization or work with a team, I always come out with a clearer understanding of what leadership is. So I was helping a group in a nonprofit organization work through some organizational challenges. And one of the aha moments this group took away from our time together was the idea that leadership involves the willingness to both extend and to receive grace. So, this idea that even though we're doing our best, we're human and we're not always going to get it right, especially the first time. And this idea that we build environments and cultures around this idea that when we fall short, whether we're a leader or a follower or a little bit of both, that it's okay. We've got each other's backs. And so we assume positive intent, right? And so, to your point, as a formal leader, when I've gone too far, when I have fallen short, when I haven't quite gotten it right, the healthy move, the leaderful move is for me to surface that and to call it out and to say, I thought I was doing the right thing. I may have overstretched. Here's how I'm going to correct it. Will you help me? Right. That's a strong move. That's a big deposit into the trust piggy bank, as it were.
When you do presentations and you say that you read the room, and when you start to address those that not necessarily are leaders in the room, but again are the future leaders, when you talk about relationship building, is that an aha moment for a lot of the people?
For some people it is. And so just like just like any other skill that there is to learn, these things come really easily to some people and they come less easily to others. And so, for some people, it's a struggle. And so, one of the things I love is to see the light bulbs go off, in these classrooms with folks who are discovering that, oh my word, there are, so many facets to being a leader. And this idea of relationality is a big one.
I'm just in charge. That's all I want to say. I'm just in charge. I got to be responsible, so I have to take a stand. Uh, I mean, that's the leader I don't want to have running me into the burning building or on the scene. And again, I want to feel that I'm a part of the decision making by my actions. Does that make any sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And so when there's a disconnect between the formal leader of an organization, group, or team and sort of the culture or the desired culture of everyone else, that sets up some real conflict. And that's tough to navigate.
Should a leader be concerned, especially trying to be a relational leader? Are you concerned about respect?
Well, that's a great question. That's a fraught question. And so I'll share my personal observation, which is the people that I've experienced who are most concerned with respect probably have a lot of work to do to earn that respect. the people who do the things that we're talking about, these relational leaders, who just sort of intuitively understand that their job is to serve the people who look to them for leadership, to make sure that they're investing in people's success other than themselves, probably have a lot more respect than they even understand.
If you're a corporate leader, and you're dealing in the business world, you I mean, I've been in that world. I've been in that world way back, and had friends that I worked with where I was in charge and actually had to fire someone, based not on performance but on economics. That's not easy when you have the relationship, as we're talking about being a relational leader, when you have to terminate that work relationship, and how you go about doing that.
Right, right. I don't know that relationality makes it easier, but it may make it more productive, and it may make it more authentic. That sort of difficult, necessary, courageous conversation. And so, if we have a history of deep relationality, maybe we are friends as well as colleagues and coworkers, and all of that kind of thing. I think it's easier to say the things that need to be said, right? And so, and also to be believed when you say those things. And so, if you can manage to terminate that relationship, that professional relationship, with humility, with honor, with dignity, perhaps with a little dose of love, that helps people recover. That helps people find a path forward with their whole selves, and that's important.
Because I would guess as well as say it being important that after the fact, that if you still remain friends, as it were, then that's going to be the test, I would take it.
You bet.
Wow. It's amazing that, and again, I think to when you speak to an organization and talk about leadership and relational leadership, and I it must be a satisfaction for you when you get that. You said aha moment, and the heads are nodding, and you're going, yeah, they understand. Are they understanding because they already do relationship leading, or is it something that you've a new idea that you've introduced, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a new idea, and I certainly wouldn't take credit for it, because people exercise relational leadership all day long, every day, at work, at church, with their family, with their friends, but just making the connection of the words leadership, relationality, right? Sometimes that's a new concept. One of the things that I love, aside from seeing those light bulbs come on, is entering into a room with the understanding that everybody here is just fine without me, but maybe I can help to make things a little bit better, right? And so when I see those aha moments happen in a classroom, in a presentation, uh, you know my next move is to sort of lead with curiosity once again, and to figure out, like what are you becoming aware of in the moment that's making this alive for you. And people often have very interesting and powerful things to say.
You must get a lot out of the post presentation conversations.
Absolutely, you bet. I love making new friends. I love developing new relationships, and everywhere I go, to speak with folks and to work with folks, it just is an opportunity to develop those relationships and deepen those relationships, and that's deeply fulfilling to me.
And hopefully the folks that you present to, including our audience, will take that back and learn about that relationship leadership, and whether you're the big L or the small L. I
That's
would
my
take.
hope.
I appreciate it, Scott. That's all for today's session on leadership and relationships. We certainly hope you now have a better understanding of how important it is to build and maintain strong connections in your leadership journey. Next time on Firewatch Live, we'll be discussing the aspirational side of leadership, how leadership is tied to change, and how great leaders take people where they need to go. It's going to be an exciting conversation, so be sure and join us. Thank you.